Emma Walker dragged her feet along the narrow sidewalk of Savannah, Georgia, her body aching from another endless shift. She worked at the butcher counter in a small grocery store, and every day felt like a battle of endurance. Hours on her feet, lifting heavy cuts of meat, wrapping, weighing, and serving without pause. By the time she clocked out, every muscle in her body screamed for rest. Tonight was no different. She stopped briefly at the checkout, bought a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and after a moment's hesitation, a whole chicken. Maybe, she thought, she would find the energy to roast it tomorrow. Back at her small apartment, Emma set the bags down on the kitchen table and dropped into a chair. For a long minute, she simply sat there, staring at nothing. Her arms and back throbbed. Her head felt heavy, and even the simple thought of standing again made her wince. She glanced at the trash bin by the counter. It was full, pressing up against the lid. She sighed. The garbage needed to go out. The last thing she wanted was another trip outside. Still, leaving it until morning meant waking up to the smell. With another sigh, half resignation, half irritation, she forced herself up, tied the bag, and carried it to the door. The evening was quiet, the kind of small-town stillness that fell over Savannah once the shops closed and neighbors retreated indoors. Emma walked the short path toward the dumpsters behind her building, the plastic bag digging into her tired hand. As she approached, she slowed. A figure sat, slumped on the bench beside the dumpsters. He was a man, unkempt and filthy, his clothes stained, his hair matted, his head bowed low as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. The smell reached her first, sour, damp, unmistakably human neglect. Emma froze, startled. Her first thought was one of irritation. A homeless man, here in her neighborhood. She clicked her tongue under her breath. Of course, she muttered, as if we needed that now. In a city as large as Atlanta, seeing the homeless was common enough. But here, in Savannah's quiet residential streets, where everyone knew everyone, it was almost unheard of. The sight of him sitting there, just feet from her building's entrance, made her skin prickle with unease. What if he carried disease? What if he caused trouble? She shook her head, disgust rising in her chest. She tossed the garbage into the dumpster with more force than necessary and turned on her heel, eager to leave the smell and him behind. But as she passed, something made her glance sideways. Just for a moment, his eyes lifted. They were sunken, ringed with exhaustion, but there was something startling in them, a flicker of depth, of humanity, that didn't match the ragged figure slouched on the bench. Emma's step faltered. She looked away quickly, muttering under her breath, and hurried back toward the stairs. Inside her apartment, she leaned against the door after locking it, pressing her palms against the wood. Why did his eyes linger in her mind? She shook her head, telling herself it was nothing, just exhaustion playing tricks. But as she sat back down at her kitchen table, she couldn't shake the feeling. Who was he? And how had someone like that ended up here, in her small corner of Georgia? The answer lay not in Savannah's quiet streets, but years earlier in another life, before the man had lost everything. His name was Jacob Reed, and once he had been someone entirely different. Years before Emma ever crossed paths with him, Jacob Reed had been a man whose life seemed set for greatness. Born into a modest family in Georgia, with a father who worked long hours in construction and a mother who juggled housekeeping with a part-time job, Jacob grew up knowing that nothing in life came easily. While his older brother followed their father into labor, Jacob's heart was elsewhere. From a young age, numbers fascinated him. Equations, chemical formulas, the quiet thrill of solving problems. Those were his companions long before he stepped foot into a lecture hall. At Georgia Tech, he earned his place not through privilege, but through determination. He supported himself by tutoring, repairing old appliances, even writing lab reports for classmates who lacked his discipline. Nights often found him hunched over textbooks under the harsh glow of library lights, his stomach empty but his mind ablaze. Professors noticed his brilliance, his restless curiosity, and by the time he completed his degree, the university offered him a position as a junior lecturer. For Jacob, that opportunity was more than a job. It was proof that his sacrifices meant something. He thrived in the classroom, his passion infectious, his research innovative. He secured a patent on one of his early projects, a device that brought him recognition and a measure of financial independence. By his late 20s, he had purchased a small apartment, furnished it carefully, and for the first time, allowed himself to dream of a family. That dream seemed to take form the day he met Lily. She was a new hire at the university, a young instructor with a quick mind and a smile that lit every room. Their connection was immediate, the kind of spark that left no room for hesitation. Within months, they were living together. Within the year, they married. Their love was fierce, their hopes high. Jacob wanted children, a bustling home filled with laughter. Lily wanted the same, but fate was cruel. Twice, Lily miscarried. Each loss hollowed them, left Jacob clinging tighter, trying to be strong for both of them. Still, they pressed on, telling themselves that time would heal. Then came the diagnosis. The disease struck fast, merciless. Doctors spoke in hushed voices, but the truth was clear. There would be no recovery. Lily's health declined rapidly, and within months she was gone. Her death shattered Jacob. The apartment that had once been filled with light turned into a tomb of silence. He stopped showing up to his lectures. Research projects gathered dust. Colleagues tried to reach him, but he brushed them aside. For a time, the department tolerated his absences. He was, after all, one of their brightest minds. But brilliance could not excuse disappearance. Eventually, the administration had no choice but to release him. By then, Jacob no longer cared. Without Lily, everything felt pointless. He withdrew from his family, ignoring calls, ignoring visits. His parents, frantic, searched for him when he vanished altogether. They arrived at his apartment only to find it abandoned. The once orderly space left in disarray, the atmosphere heavy with despair. Days of searching turned into weeks. When their efforts brought nothing, they filed a missing person report. The trail went cold. Jacob Reed disappeared into the margins of society. The once celebrated academic faded from view, trading lecture halls for back alleys, the respect of colleagues for the indifference of strangers. And it was in this broken state that Emma Walker would one day find him, slumped beside a dumpster in Savannah, unrecognizable from the man he once was. The following week, life at the grocery store pressed on as usual. Emma worked the counter with her colleague Donna Price, who was quick to chatter as they scrubbed down their stations. Donna glanced at Emma with a knowing smirk. "You've got it easy," she said. "No husband, no kids, just yourself to take care of. Must be nice." Emma smiled faintly, unwilling to share the ache she carried, the yearning for a family of her own. She kept her thoughts to herself, unaware that the man she had dismissed days earlier would soon alter the course of her quiet life. It was late in the evening when Emma turned the corner onto her street, her grocery bag tucked under one arm, her mind already drifting toward the comfort of bed. The autumn air in Savannah was cool, heavy with the scent of damp leaves, the kind of night when most of the town had already settled behind drawn curtains. She longed for silence, for stillness. But as she neared her building, she slowed. There he was again, the same man she had noticed by the dumpsters days earlier, Jacob Reed. He sat hunched on the bench just outside her apartment complex, head bowed, body folded in on itself as though he were trying to disappear into the night. Emma's chest tightened. She considered crossing to the other side of the street, avoiding him altogether. What business of hers was it if some drifter chose to haunt her block? She shook her head, muttering under her breath, and kept walking. But as she drew level with the bench, movement caught her eye. Jacob shifted, then faltered. His body tilted as though the bench itself had betrayed him, and before Emma could react, he nearly collapsed to the ground. A strangled sound escaped his lips, weak, barely audible. Emma froze. Every instinct urged her to keep going. He wasn't her responsibility. She had her own problems, her own exhaustion, but something rooted her in place. She stared at the crumpled figure, his chest rising and falling with difficulty, his skin pale beneath the grime. This wasn't drunkenness, she realized. This was something else, something worse. Her heart thudded painfully. She took a hesitant step closer. "Hey," she said softly, almost against her will. "Are you okay?" His eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest second, they met hers. There was no hostility there, no madness, only pain. He gave the slightest nod, as if admitting the truth cost him the last shred of strength he had. Emma's throat tightened. She should walk away. She should call someone else. But her phone was nearly dead, the screen dark, and the thought of leaving him sprawled on the sidewalk gnawed at her. Cursing under her breath, she crouched beside him. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's get you up." With effort, Jacob allowed her to help. His body was alarmingly light, as though every ounce of muscle had wasted away. Step by shaky step, she guided him through the entryway, up the short flight of stairs, and into her apartment. She eased him onto the couch, her breath quick, her palms damp with nerves. Her phone flickered to life after she plugged it in. Hands trembling, she dialed 911. Within minutes, the wail of a siren pierced the night, and EMTs climbed the stairs, their presence filling her small living room. They examined Jacob swiftly, their flashlights and medical bags turning the space into a temporary clinic. The diagnosis was clear: severe malnutrition, exhaustion, dehydration. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to explain his collapse. They urged him to come with them, to be admitted for further care. But Jacob shook his head firmly, his voice hoarse yet determined. He signed the AMA form against medical advice, refusing hospitalization. Emma stood by, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, torn between relief and unease. Relief that it wasn't worse. Unease that he would be staying here in her apartment, even if only for the night. When the EMTs packed up and left, the silence that followed was deafening. Emma leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the figure slumped on her couch. His breathing was shallow, his eyes closed, his face gaunt yet strangely peaceful in the dim light. Somewhere deep inside, Emma knew the truth. By helping him inside, by calling for help, by refusing to walk away, she had crossed an invisible line. This man was no longer a stranger on a bench. For better or worse, she had let him into her world. And as she stood there, staring at him, the weight of that choice settled heavily on her shoulders. The apartment was quiet after the EMTs left, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Emma lingered by the kitchen counter, still uncertain. She had carried Jacob in on impulse, but now what? He was too weak to leave, and she couldn't imagine simply putting him back on the street. She glanced toward the couch. His eyes were half open, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to adjust himself against the cushions. A surge of pity swept over her, pushing back the irritation that had first flared when she saw him by the dumpsters. Emma turned toward the stove. She had a pot of chicken soup from the day before, nothing fancy, just broth, vegetables, and bits of meat. She warmed a bowl and carried it to the couch, setting it on the coffee table. Pulling a chair close, she sat down and lifted the spoon. "Here," she said gently, holding it toward him. Jacob shifted, his gaze dropping to the steaming bowl. Slowly he shook his head. His voice was rough but firm. "Please, I can do it myself." Emma blinked, surprised. She expected him to be too weak to resist, but there was pride in his tone, something unbroken. With visible effort, he pushed himself upright, his hand trembling as he reached for the spoon. She hesitated, then let him take it. His fingers closed awkwardly around the handle, and he began to eat, slowly, carefully. It was clear the soup brought him relief. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time since she had seen him, there was a trace of peace in his expression. When the bowl was nearly empty, he set the spoon down and leaned back, exhausted. "Thank you," he murmured. Then, after a pause, he looked at her with an expression that was almost apologetic. "I'm sorry for being here, for troubling you. I'll rest a little and then I'll go. I don't want to cause you any inconvenience." Emma's lips parted, but no words came at first. She had expected bitterness, entitlement, or silence. Instead, his voice was measured, his manner courteous. It startled her. This was not the way most people imagined a homeless man would speak. "You don't need to apologize," she managed. "You're not well. Just stay put for now." He nodded faintly, closing his eyes for a moment. Emma rose, restless. Something about his voice, the careful way he formed his words, had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. On impulse, she walked to her closet and pulled out a duffel bag tucked on the top shelf. Inside were old clothes her younger brother had left during his visits, jeans, shirts, even a razor kit. She carried it back to the living room and set it near the couch. "Here," she said quietly. "There are some clean clothes. And a razor if you want. The bathroom's down the hall." Jacob's eyes opened, and for the first time, she saw embarrassment flicker across his face. He looked down at his own grimy hands, at the tattered sleeves of his shirt. "That's generous of you," he said softly. Emma didn't reply. She simply gestured toward the hallway. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His movements were unsteady, but he waved off her instinct to help. "I can manage," he insisted. She let him go, watching as he disappeared into the bathroom. The sound of running water filled the apartment. Emma sat back down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. Part of her whispered that this was dangerous. She didn't know this man. He could be anyone, a criminal, a thief. What if she was being foolish? But another part of her, the part that had made her stop on the sidewalk and lift him up, couldn't let go of the truth she had seen in his eyes. He was broken, yes, but not beyond saving. Minutes later, the bathroom door creaked open. Jacob stepped out wearing her brother's clothes. They hung a little loose on his thin frame, but he looked transformed. His hair, once matted, was combed back. The beard that had obscured his face was gone, replaced by clean-shaven skin. He looked younger, and though still gaunt, there was no mistaking the quiet dignity that lingered beneath the exhaustion. Jacob shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Thank you," he said again, his voice low. "For the meal. For this. I'll repay you somehow when I can." Emma studied him, torn between suspicion and something else she couldn't name. She gave a small nod. "Just rest. That's enough for now." And as he lowered himself back onto the couch, the fragile beginning of trust settled between them. Uncertain, delicate, but real. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Emma found herself doing things she never imagined she would. Cooking extra portions, setting aside medicine, and checking on the man who now occupied her couch. At first, it felt awkward, like she was hosting a stranger who might vanish at any moment. But each morning when she left for work, Jacob was still there, quiet, weak but slowly regaining strength. The EMTs had left instructions before they departed that night. Electrolyte fluids, vitamins, light meals to rebuild his strength. Emma took their word seriously. On her way home from the store each evening, she stopped by the pharmacy aisle, picking up bottles of supplements and electrolyte packets. At the counter, she bought fresh vegetables, bread, milk. Preparing meals no longer felt like a chore done for herself alone. It carried a new purpose. Still, not everyone saw it that way. At work, Donna Price raised her eyebrows when Emma mentioned the man staying in her apartment. "Emma, are you out of your mind?" she asked one afternoon as they cleaned their knives at the butcher counter. "You don't know him. He could be dangerous, a thief or worse, and you just let him into your home." Emma bristled, focusing on scrubbing the cutting board. "He was sick, Donna. I couldn't just leave him on the street." Donna scoffed. "That's how people get themselves hurt. You think the world runs on good intentions. Wake up. You've worked too hard to lose everything to some drifter." Emma didn't answer. She had no defense beyond the truth she felt in her gut. that walking away had never been an option. Still, Donna's words lingered. That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, doubts crowded in. Was she being naive? Foolish? She barely had enough for herself, and now she was sharing with a man she hardly knew. But when she opened the door and saw Jacob sitting upright, waiting with a tentative smile, the weight of those doubts loosened. He had shaved again, his posture straighter. Though still thin, his eyes were clearer than before. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice steadying a little more each day. "How was work?" The question startled her. It was the kind of thing friends asked, not a man who had collapsed outside her building. She shrugged. The usual. Long loud. He nodded, listening, as if the details of her day actually mattered. Later, over dinner, he began to speak of himself. At first, it came in fragments. A mention of teaching. A reference to a wife named Lily. His voice carried both warmth and sorrow, like he was turning over fragile glass in his hands. Emma listened, her heart tightening. He told her about meeting Lily at Georgia Tech, about the joy of their early years, about the devastating miscarriages. His eyes clouded when he spoke of Lily's illness, the speed with which it took her, the helplessness of watching her fade. His words faltered, but Emma filled the silence with patience, letting him continue when he was ready. When he admitted that he had lost everything afterward, his job, his will to live, his place in the world, Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. She imagined the lecture halls, the students who once looked to him with respect, an empty apartment that had become a monument to grief. "I wasn't strong enough," Jacob whispered. "I thought I could handle it, but when she was gone, it was like the ground disappeared beneath me." Emma reached for her glass of water, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that surviving such loss wasn't weakness, but the words caught in her throat. All she could manage was a quiet, "I'm sorry." Jacob gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "So am I." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was weighted, fragile, but it carried something new, an understanding that went beyond words. Emma realized then that what connected them wasn't pity. It was recognition. She had spent years longing for someone to care for, someone to build a life with, while he had lost precisely that. Somehow, their broken pieces seemed to fit together in ways neither of them had expected. And though the world outside would never understand, within the walls of Emma's small apartment, a fragile connection had begun to take root. Weeks passed, and with each one, Jacob grew stronger. The hollows beneath his eyes softened, his shoulders straightened, and he began moving around Emma's apartment with more certainty. At first, it was small things, folding the blanket he had used on the couch, rinsing his own dishes after meals. But soon, Emma noticed him sweeping the kitchen floor, fixing a loose cabinet door, even changing a flickering light bulb without being asked. "You don't have to do that," she told him one evening when she came home to find the trash already taken out. Jacob only smiled faintly. "I want to. You've done enough for me. Let me give something back." Despite his gratitude, a quiet tension began to grow. One night, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Jacob cleared his throat. "Emma, I think it's time I left." The words landed heavily, and she set down her fork. "Left? Where would you go?" He looked down, ashamed. "Anywhere. I've taken too much already. You don't owe me this roof, this food. I was never meant to stay." Emma's chest tightened. She should have expected this moment, but the thought of her apartment without him suddenly felt unbearable. He had filled a space in her life she hadn't realized was empty until now. She shook her head. "Jacob, you're not a burden. You're," she faltered, searching for the right word. "You're part of this place now, at least to me." His eyes softened, but he didn't argue further. Not long after, Emma found herself doing something she had considered before but never acted on, reaching out. She tracked down a phone number tucked inside a weathered notebook Jacob had carried but never used. It belonged to his parents, The call was hesitant, her voice trembling as she introduced herself. When they arrived days later, the reunion was overwhelming. His mother clung to him as though afraid he might vanish again, tears streaking her face. His father, a man hardened by years of labor, broke down openly in the small apartment, gripping Jacob's shoulders as if anchoring him to the world again. Gratitude poured from them, directed at Emma, who stood quietly to the side, unsure how to respond. "You brought our son back to us," his mother whispered, pulling Emma into an embrace. "We thought we'd lost him forever." For Jacob, that day became a turning point. Surrounded by the warmth of family, something inside him shifted. The fog of despair that had weighed him down for years began to lift. That evening, as the four of them sat together, he spoke of returning to research, not for money, not for recognition, but because it had once given him purpose. "I can't waste this second chance," he said firmly. "Lily would never have wanted that." Emma watched him, pride welling up in her chest. She had seen him at his lowest, broken and hollow, and now here he was, choosing to stand again. In the months that followed, Jacob rebuilt piece by piece. He reconnected with colleagues, revisited old projects, and spent long nights poring over research materials Emma helped him find. The spark that once defined him slowly returned, illuminating the man beneath the scars of grief. Through it all, Emma remained by his side. What had begun as obligation transformed into something deeper. She realized at the night he repaired the old clock that had belonged to her grandmother. He set it on the shelf, hand steady now, and when he looked up at her, she felt a rush of warmth she could no longer deny. He must have felt it too, because his gaze lingered, soft and steady, before he finally spoke. "Emma, I never thought I could feel this again." Her heart answered before her voice did. "Neither did I." A year after the night she first carried him into her apartment, Emma walked down the aisle of a small church in Savannah. Jacob stood waiting, dressed in a simple suit, his expression one of awe. Their vows were quiet, intimate, but heavy with the weight of all they had endured. When they exchanged rings, it wasn't just a union of two people. It was a promise born of loss, survival, and the courage to start again. The seasons turned, and with them came a new chapter Emma had long dreamed of but never dared to believe possible. In the springtime, she gave birth to a son, a boy with Jacob's steady eyes and her own warm smile. They named him Caleb. From the moment she held him in her arms, Emma felt a completeness she had yearned for her entire adult life. The sleepless nights, the long feedings, the exhaustion that tugged at her bones, it all melted in the face of Caleb's soft breathing, his tiny fingers curling tightly around hers. Jacob was no less transformed. Where once despair had ruled his days, now it was joy. He held his son with reverence, as though every moment were sacred. Friends and family often caught him studying the baby's face, overcome by the miracle of it. For a man who had thought all chance of family was lost, Caleb was proof that hope could return even after devastation. As the months passed, Jacob threw himself back into work. With Emma's encouragement, he reached out to his old colleagues in Atlanta, re-establishing ties that had long frayed. His reputation, though scarred by his years of absence, had not been forgotten. Slowly, he was welcomed back into the world of research. Soon, his projects were once again producing results, and one of his innovations drew the attention of investors. For the first time in years, steady income returned, not just enough to survive, but enough to plan for a future. Emma, too, began to reclaim dreams she had buried. With Jacob's insistence and support, she left her job at the grocery store. The butcher counter that had consumed her youth no longer defined her. Instead, she enrolled at a local college, finally chasing the education she had once thought out of reach. Walking onto campus as a student, books in hand, she felt the thrill of possibility spark inside her. Their lives shifted quickly. With Jacob's research providing financial stability, they bought a modest but spacious home on the outskirts of Savannah, a white house with a porch shaded by oaks, a place where Caleb could play in the yard. Moving day was chaotic and joyful, their small family laughing as they unpacked boxes late into the night. For Emma, standing in the doorway of their new home, it was the embodiment of everything she had longed for. Not just shelter, but a true sanctuary. Even as she studied and cared for Caleb, Emma found herself pulled towards something more. The memory of Jacob slumped outside her building never left her, nor did the countless faces she now noticed on Savannah streets, men and women who carried the same hollow look he once had. She began volunteering at a shelter downtown, first serving meals, then organizing clothing drives. Soon, her involvement deepened. She spoke to community groups, advocating for compassion, reminding them that homelessness was not a life choice but often the result of heartbreak and misfortune. Jacob supported her every step of the way. In the evenings, when Emma returned from her classes or her volunteer work, he listened intently as she shared the stories she had heard. He never forgot his own journey, and together they resolved that their family would not only live for themselves, but also for others who needed a second chance. Their days were full, sometimes exhausting, but always meaningful. Caleb grew quickly, his laughter echoing through the house, filling every corner with life. On weekends, the three of them strolled through Forsyth Park, Jacob pushing the stroller while Emma walked beside him, their hands brushing together. They spoke of the future, of siblings for Caleb, of new research Jacob hoped to publish, of the degree Emma would soon earn. There were no illusions that life would always be easy. But for Emma and Jacob, the hardships of the past had forged something stronger than certainty: resilience. They had walked through grief and despair, and together they had chosen to build again. And in the glow of their new home, surrounded by love and purpose, they knew their story was not one of tragedy anymore. It was one of rebirth. 6 years slipped by like pages turning in a well-loved book. Life for the Reed family had blossomed in ways that once felt impossible. Jacob's work in science was not only restored, but thriving. His renewed research had earned recognition again, and though he carried the scars of his lost years, those scars no longer defined him. They reminded him of what had been rebuilt. Conferences, collaborations, published papers, all returned, but this time Jacob balanced them with something greater: the quiet joy of fatherhood and the steady presence of Emma. Emma, too, had transformed. The woman who once trudged home from the butcher counter exhausted and alone was now a college graduate, a community advocate, a wife, and a mother. Her days were full, but never empty. Between raising Caleb, supporting Jacob, and running outreach programs for the homeless in Savannah, she had become known not only as Jacob Reed's wife, but as a woman in her own right, a voice of compassion in their town. Caleb grew in the middle of all this love, his childhood bright and secure. He was a curious boy, always asking questions, forever tugging at Jacob's sleeve for explanations about the stars, about the way plants grew, about anything that caught his imagination. His laughter echoed through their house, filling it with life, a constant reminder of how far they had come. The community had taken notice, too. Stories spread of the family, whose beginning was stranger than fiction. The Miracle family, neighbors called them with affection. Everyone in Savannah seemed to know how Emma had found Jacob slumped by the dumpsters that night, how she had brought him inside, how that single act had changed everything. In a town where gossip traveled fast, theirs became a story not of scandal but of hope, a tale retold in churches, schools, and local gatherings as proof that kindness still mattered. One crisp autumn morning, Emma and Jacob walked hand in hand down the sidewalk, Caleb skipping a few steps ahead with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. It was his first day at a new grade, and excitement radiated from him. The sun filtered through the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks, casting a golden glow over the quiet street. At the school entrance, Caleb turned and waved. "Bye, Mom." "Bye, Dad." His grin was wide, his eyes alight with confidence. Jacob knelt to adjust the strap of his son's backpack one last time, pressing a quick kiss to his hair, while Emma brushed a hand across Caleb's cheek. Then, with one final glance, the boy darted toward the building, joining the stream of children filing inside. From the window, his teacher paused, watching the family. She smiled to herself, struck by the tenderness of the moment. She had heard whispers of their story, the way Jacob had fallen, the way Emma had lifted him, and seeing them now, standing side by side, it felt like witnessing a miracle in motion. As the school doors closed behind Caleb, Emma slipped her arm through Jacob's. They lingered a moment on the sidewalk, neither in a hurry to leave. The air was filled with the ordinary sounds of a morning. Car engines, children's chatter. But for them, it was layered with memory. Jacob squeezed her hand. "Do you remember that night?" Emma didn't need to ask which one. The dumpster, the collapse, the decision to stop instead of walk away. Those images would never leave her. She nodded. "I do. I remember thinking I was crazy, bringing you home." He chuckled softly, his eyes glistening. "Maybe you were, but it saved me." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice quiet. "It saved me too." They stood there, side by side, letting the years between then and now wash over them. The loneliness, the grief, the fear, all of it had led here. To a family, to love, to a life neither of them had dared to hope for. As they turned toward home, the lesson of their journey was clear, not only to them, but to all who knew their story. Sometimes a single choice could alter the course of a life. Sometimes the smallest act of compassion could light a path through the darkest night. And for Emma and Jacob, that truth had become their legacy. In the end, theirs was not a story about tragedy, though it had begun there. It was a story about what could grow from ashes when kindness was offered freely. A reminder that even in the quiet corners of a small southern town, miracles could unfold, not with spectacle, but with simple, steadfast love. Kindness had saved one life, then two, and in time, it had created a family, and that, more than any invention or accolade, was proof that miracles were real. I was standing by the gift table, holding a baby blanket I'd spent 2 weeks crocheting, when my younger sister tapped her glass and said, "I have something to tell you all." The room quieted instantly. Dozens of faces turned toward her, some curious, others already bracing for drama. But no one, not even I, could have expected what came next. Sabrina Carter was glowing, 8 months pregnant, wearing a silky pale blue maternity dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked every bit the center of attention. The decorations in our parents' living room were ridiculous. Pink and blue streamers, a towering diaper cake, and party games that had already dragged on too long. But this was the crescendo. She placed one hand on her belly, looked directly at me and said, "The father of this baby is Noah Monroe." There was a moment of pure silence. Not shock, silence. And then it hit me. Gasps, murmurs, chair scraping. I couldn't breathe. Noah Monroe. My husband. My dead husband. My heart dropped so hard it felt like it cracked something inside me. I gripped the edge of the table just to stay standing. I wanted to scream, to laugh, to fall through the floor. Instead, I stood there frozen as Sabrina continued, her voice clear, rehearsed, and disturbingly proud. "Since this baby is Noah's only child," she said, "I have the right to half of everything he left behind, his estate, his accounts, his downtown apartment. My child deserves his legacy. Half of everything. Half of the $12 million my late husband left behind after building a tech firm from scratch. Half of the home we lived in together. Half of the life I had been trying to hold onto since he died." I looked at my parents, expecting at least some trace of confusion or outrage. But their faces, they weren't surprised. My father's mouth was tight, arms crossed. My mother was holding Sabrina's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. They knew. They already knew. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My body was shaking so violently I had to press both palms against the table. The blanket in my hand slipped to the floor. Sabrina turned to me with that infuriating half-smile she always wore when she got exactly what she wanted. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said, her tone syrupy sweet, "but you deserve to know. And so does everyone else." The room was spinning. My skin felt hot and cold at the same time. I backed away slowly, then bolted through the crowd, bumping shoulders and knocking over a plate of cupcakes without even noticing. Someone called after me, maybe my mom. I didn't turn around. By the time I reached my car, I was crying so hard I couldn't get the key into the ignition. The sound of my heartbeat pounded in my ears like war drums. I finally drove off, the blanket still on the floor behind me, party decorations fading in the rearview mirror. I didn't know what hurt more, that Noah had betrayed me, that my sister had done this, or that my parents had stood behind her with pride. But what I did know, even in that moment, was this: whatever they'd started, I was going to finish. The drive home was a blur of taillights and tears. I couldn't remember the turns I took or the traffic lights I ran. When I finally pulled into the driveway of the house Noah and I once called home, I sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes, unable to move. Everything inside me felt broken, twisted in a way that would never be the same again. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just sat on the edge of the bed staring at the photo of our wedding day. His smile so wide, his hands around my waist like I was the center of his world. I traced the outline of his face with my finger and whispered, "Why?" At 2:13 a.m., my phone lit up. It was Sabrina. A photo. Noah and Sabrina. In a hotel room, his arms around her waist. Her phone in the mirror, capturing the kiss. My stomach turned so violently I barely made it to the bathroom in time. When I came back, another message was waiting. Another photo, this time at a restaurant I didn't recognize, their fingers intertwined across the table, smiling like they didn't just destroy someone. Then came the texts. "I don't love her anymore. After the divorce, we'll tell everyone. I want a life with you and our baby." Each one landed like a hammer to the chest. Each one chipped away at the version of Noah I had believed in, loved, cried for, mourned. The timestamps stretched back 6 months. During that same time, I had been injecting hormones, crying in sterile clinics, blaming myself for every negative pregnancy test. I remembered the way Noah would hold my hand during appointments, tell me not to stress, promise we'd try again next month, all while sneaking away to hotels with my sister. At 4 a.m., I found myself in the nursery we'd started to prepare before giving up. The paint samples were still taped to the walls. The crib was half assembled, gathering dust. I sat on the floor and stared at the tiny shoes I had bought out of hope. Now they looked like artifacts from another life. My phone buzzed again. "I know this is hard," Sabrina had written, "but we can make this work. You and I are still sisters. That baby is your blood too." I didn't reply. I couldn't. Instead, I deleted every message and threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a sharp crack, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. I didn't even check to see if it broke. That night, something in me began to shift. The grief was still there, sharp and raw, but under it, something darker had started to bloom. Resolve. They wanted to drag me into their lie, force me to play along, hand over half of Noah's legacy to a child I had no reason to trust. But I wasn't going to crumble the way they expected. They thought they knew me, thought I was too soft, too obedient, too desperate for their approval. They were wrong. At exactly 6:04 a.m., the phone rang again. I had just managed to close my eyes for the first time all night when the screen lit up with Mom. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. A minute later, it rang again, Dad. I answered on the third call, half out of habit, half because something in me wanted to hear their excuse. What I got instead was strategy. "Valerie!" My father's voice was firm, emotionless, like he was reading from a memo. "You need to be reasonable. Sabrina's child is entitled to a portion of Noah's estate. The sooner you agree to divide the assets, the easier this will be for everyone." "Easier for who?" I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "For you? For her?" For all of us, my mother chimed in, and that's when I realized they had me on speakerphone. I sat up slowly. When did you know? There was silence on the other end. That heavy, damning silence that only ever means guilt. Then my mother's voice, soft, like a confession she didn't want to own. We've known for a while. Noah told us, maybe 7 months before the accident. 7 months. They had known for 7 months. They let me hold Noah's cold hand at the funeral. Sobbing into a dress Sabrina helped me pick. They hugged me when I couldn't stop crying. They sat at my table every Sunday eating the meals I cooked, sipping wine I paid for, all while carrying the secret. And still they took my money. Every month. $3,000 wired automatically into their account because I believed naively that we were rebuilding something. That losing Noah had softened them. That for the first time in decades they actually saw me. I laughed. A short, dry sound that cracked the stillness of the room. You're disgusting, I said. All of you. My dad scoffed. Watch your tone, young lady. You think this is easy for us. No, I snapped. I think this is exactly who you are, and I'm the idiot who kept hoping you'd change. I hung up and immediately opened my banking app. I deleted the recurring transfer in 2 taps. It felt surgical, clean, like cutting off a tumor. Let Sabrina take care of them. Let their golden girl pay their bills with her non-existent smoothie business and half-finished life coach certification. Let her feed them lies along with whatever leftovers she scrapes together in that dingy apartment across town. As for me, I was done pretending I still belonged to that family. That night, I packed up a box of Noah's things, his watch, his favorite hoodie, the framed photo from our honeymoon, and shoved it into the back of the closet. I couldn't look at him anymore. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I knew this much. The next time they came for me, they'd find a different woman waiting. 3 weeks passed. I didn't hear from my parents again. Not directly, at least. But Sabrina? She was relentless. At first it was more photos, then voicemails, some sad and trembling, others sharp with entitlement. I stopped listening. I stopped looking. I stopped feeling, until the letter came. Thick envelope, formal font, a law firm I didn't recognize. I opened it on the kitchen counter, the same spot where Noah used to cut vegetables while humming under his breath. My fingers trembled. Inside was a copy of the legal complaint. Sabrina Carter, plaintiff, filing for a 50% claim to Noah Monroe's estate on behalf of her unborn child. It used the word voluntarily in describing the division she expected from me, but it read like a threat. The letter said I had 10 days to respond. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I walked to the sink, turned on the cold water, and let it run over my wrists until the numbness crawled back up my spine. Then I pulled out my laptop and started looking for an attorney. I didn't need a bulldog. I needed a surgeon. Someone who could dismantle a lie without missing a single cut. It took 4 days, 5 consultations, and 1 phone call that ended with me slamming the laptop shut in tears before I found Marcus Kellerman. His office was small, lined with law books and silent trophies. He listened carefully, taking notes with a fountain pen, not interrupting once. When I finished talking, he looked up and said, "Your sister's going to regret putting this on paper." "But she has proof," I said. "Photos, texts my parents will testify." He nodded, his face unreadable. "They'll make the court sympathetic, especially since she's carrying a child. Judges don't like leaving babies out in the cold. So I don't stand a chance." I didn't say that. He flipped a page in my file. I said she'll make the court sympathetic. But sympathy doesn't override fact. And truth has a funny way of surviving the mud. I exhaled just barely. Marcus agreed to take the case. Told me to forward every text, every voicemail, every email. We would build a timeline. Reconstruct Noah's assets. Review the trust and its contingencies. He was calm, precise, and expensive. I didn't care. That night, as I prepared the documents he asked for, my phone buzzed again, an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something in me paused. I answered. "Is this Valerie Monroe?" a woman asked. Her voice was calm, controlled, but underneath it, something cracked. "Yes. Who's calling?" "I'm Evelyn Monroe," she said. "Noah's mother." The world tilted again. I reached for the countertop like I had during the baby shower, my knees suddenly soft. I was told she died. There was a pause. "Noah told you that," she said. "He lied. About many things. And if you're willing, I think it's time you knew the rest." We met the next morning at a small cafe tucked between a florist and a consignment shop downtown. I got there early, more from nerves and punctuality, and sat in the corner booth furthest from the door. My coffee cooled untouched. My fingers wouldn't stop shaking. When Evelyn Monroe walked in, I recognized her instantly, not because I had seen her before, but because she looked like Noah. The eyes, the posture, even the way she moved, graceful but guarded, was him. For a second, my throat tightened and I had to look away. She sat across from me, setting her leather bag gently on the seat beside her. No makeup, hair pulled into a simple twist. A woman who didn't come to impress, only to be heard. "I was at the funeral," she said softly. "Back row. Black veil. I left before the service ended. I didn't think I had the right to mourn him publicly." I remembered her now, a quiet figure in the shadows that day, one I'd chalked up to distant family or neighbor. I never imagined. "He told me you were dead," I whispered. Evelyn's lips pressed together, not in anger. Something sadder, something older. Noah had his reasons for cutting ties. They weren't all unjustified, but lying about my death, that was cruel even for him. I looked at her then, really looked. There were years of pain in her face, a woman who had survived more than just her son's betrayal. "I heard what your sister's doing," she said, pulling out a worn envelope from her bag. "And I can't stay silent. Not again." She slid it across the table. Inside were hospital records. Hartford General, dated 11 years ago. I scanned the pages, my pulse pounding louder with every line. Complete azoospermia. Permanently sterile. No natural conception possible. The words blurred for a second as my vision fogged. I had to reread them. This isn't possible," I muttered. "We spent years trying to have a baby. Fertility specialists, hormone injections, tracking cycles. He held my hand through every appointment. He knew," Evelyn said gently. "He got the diagnosis at 26. He was devastated. It was the last thing we ever talked about before we stopped speaking." A part of me crumbled right there in that booth. The grief, the guilt, the months I spent thinking something was wrong with me, they all unraveled into a new shape: rage. I had lived in silence, blamed my body, begged the universe for something no one knew would never happen, because he'd already decided I didn't deserve the truth. Evelyn reached across the table, her hand soft and trembling. "I know it doesn't undo the betrayal, but if Sabrina's child isn't his, you deserve to know. And the court needs to know." I nodded slowly. "Would you be willing to take a DNA test? If they ask for confirmation." "I came prepared for that," she said. "I'm not afraid of the truth anymore." For the first time in months, something inside me shifted. Not peace, not yet, but clarity, the kind that steadies you after a long, disorienting storm. I left that cafe with the envelope pressed to my chest like armor. Noah had built a house of lies, but I was done living in it. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in energy, the kind of cold that sinks into your skin and settles in your spine. I sat at the defendant's table, eyes locked straight ahead, trying not to look at the woman sitting just a few feet away from me. My sister, Sabrina Carter, wearing a black wrap dress, minimal makeup, and an expression of polished grief. She held the baby in her arms like a shield. My parents were behind her. My mother's hand rested on Sabrina's shoulder, while my father leaned forward with quiet intensity, the kind he used to reserve for job interviews and tax audits. Across the aisle, Marcus Kellerman flipped through his notes, calm and meticulous as always. "She's rehearsed," he said under his breath. But truth doesn't need rehearsal, just timing. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The sound of heels and polished shoes against linoleum echoed like gunfire. Opening statements came and went. Sabrina's attorney painted a heartbreaking picture: a widowed sister, pregnant with the only child of a man gone too soon. She spoke about legacy, about responsibility, about family. She even cried on cue. And then it was her turn to speak. Sabrina walked to the witness stand, the baby cradled in her arms like a trophy. Her voice quivered just enough. "Noah loved me. We didn't mean for it to happen, but sometimes love doesn't ask for permission. We were planning to tell Valerie after the divorce." She dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "All I want is what's fair for our child. He deserves his father's name, his home, his inheritance." The judge nodded, neutral. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. Mrs. Monroe, your counsel may proceed." Marcus stood slowly, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that Ms. Carter's claims are not only misleading, but entirely false. We request that this court consider medical documentation relevant to Mr. Monroe's reproductive health." He handed a sealed folder to the bailiff, who brought it to the bench. The judge skimmed through the contents, her face unreadable. "Where did this come from?" Sabrina's lawyer demanded. "From Mr. Monroe's biological mother, Evelyn Monroe," Marcus replied, turning toward the back of the courtroom. "Who is present and willing to testify." Gasps rippled across the room. Sabrina's head snapped up. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time that day, her composure cracked. Evelyn stood. She looked older than she had at the cafe. Perhaps it was the lighting or the gravity of the moment, but her voice was clear. "Your Honor, I'm here to provide a DNA sample. If this child is my grandson, I will not stand in the way of his rights. But if he is not, the truth deserves to be known." The judge nodded once. "DNA testing is hereby ordered. This court will reconvene when results are available." Sabrina looked like she was about to faint. Her skin had gone pale. She clutched the baby tighter, then turned toward her mother with panicked eyes. But for once, there was no comfort there, just quiet confusion. As the gavel struck and everyone began to rise, I remained seated for a beat longer. I wasn't shaking anymore. For the first time in months, I felt still. The courtroom was silent when the judge returned with the envelope. I could hear the faint rustling of papers, the baby's soft breathing, and somewhere behind me, a woman whispering a prayer under her breath. Sabrina sat rigid, her arms wrapped around the sleeping child. Her face was a mask, composed but too still. The judge cleared her throat. "These results confirm," she began, eyes scanning the room with clinical precision, "that there is no genetic match between the child in question and Mrs. Evelyn Monroe. Therefore, the court finds that Noah Monroe is not the biological father of the child." A sharp gasp escaped from someone in the gallery. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father sank back in his seat, eyes wide and unblinking. But it was Sabrina's face that held me. For the first time, there was no performance, no smug smile, just collapse. She shook her head once, slowly, then again, faster, like she could rewind the moment by sheer force of will. "That's not possible," she said, her voice barely audible. "No, those records are fake. She faked them. She made it all up." The judge held up a hand. "Ms. Carter, sit down." But Sabrina wouldn't. She stood now, clutching the baby with one arm and waving her other hand in the air like a drowning swimmer reaching for a lifeline. "I was seeing someone else," she blurted, her voice cracking. "Okay, I was seeing more than one person when Noah died. But I thought it had to be him. He had the most to leave behind." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the shifting of bodies. My parents looked like statues, pale, silent, hollow. The judge raised her voice over the noise. Let the record show that Ms. Carter admits to knowingly deceiving this court and the defendant with fraudulent claims. This court rules in favor of Valerie Monroe. All claims to the estate filed by Ms. Carter are permanently dismissed. The gavel dropped like thunder. Just like that, it was over. Sabrina sank back into her chair, her makeup streaked with tears, holding a child who had no idea he'd just lost everything his mother had tried to steal. The lie collapsed under its own weight. And the truth, it stood quietly in the light. Outside the courtroom, I stepped into the sun like it was the first time I'd seen it in months. Evelyn was waiting by the curb, a hand on the door of her car. When she saw me, she didn't say anything, just opened her arms. I didn't hesitate. We stood like that for a long time. I had walked into that courthouse with grief, betrayal, and a mountain of doubt, and walked out with something unexpected. Not revenge, not justice, just freedom. My parents caught up to me in the courthouse parking lot. My mother's cheeks were streaked with tears, her eyes bloodshot and searching. My father looked smaller, not just older, but diminished somehow, like the air around him had been pulled away. "Valerie," she whispered, reaching for my hand. "Sweetheart, we didn't know. We didn't know she was lying." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I pulled out my phone, pressed 3 buttons, and held it up so they could see. Their names. Blocked. Permanently. My mother gasped. My father didn't say a word. "I warned you," I said quietly. "You chose her. And now you live with that choice." Then I turned and walked toward Evelyn, who was waiting by her car, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. She opened the door, but paused when I approached. "You okay?" she asked. I surprised us both by laughing. Not out of joy, but something close to peace. "I think I will be." We stood there for a moment, watching the people spill out of the courthouse behind us like they were leaving a theater, as if our lives were just a show that had finally reached its final act. I reached into my purse and pulled out a keyring. 1 key. Silver. Smooth edges. "This is for the apartment," I said. "Downtown. The one Noah left me. I never liked it. Too many ghosts. But maybe you'd like it." Evelyn froze. "Valerie, no. I couldn't. You gave me the truth," I said. "You gave me back my life. Let me give you this." She cried, quietly, the way women cry when they've been strong for far too long. It was the safest I'd felt in years. A week later, I signed over the deed. She called it too generous. I called it balance. Since then, I've started building a life that's mine. Not inherited. Not constructed from Noah's shadow. Mine. I went back to work full-time. Marcus introduced me to his wife, who got me into a hiking club. I hated it the first few weeks. Mud, sweat, the blisters, but there was something about climbing a hill alone and standing at the top that made everything below feel manageable. I took a solo trip to Vermont, rented a cabin. No cell service, no expectations. Just me, a stack of old books, and the sound of wind through trees. I cried one night, then slept 12 hours straight. It was the best sleep I'd had since the funeral. Sabrina sent a letter last month. Handwritten. The envelope was pale pink, the handwriting painfully familiar. She said she was sorry, that she had changed, that she needed help. I didn't open it. I dropped it into the trash without a second thought. Some endings don't need to be rewritten. I still see Evelyn every Sunday. We cook together. Talk about Noah, not the version who lied, but the little boy she once knew. The one who collected rocks and named squirrels. She tells me stories that soften the jagged edges. I let them. Yesterday, I packed the last of his things. A few went to charity. The rest, to a storage unit I'll probably forget exists. When I looked at myself in the mirror this morning, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked free. I lost the family I was born into, but I found one I chose. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only kind that ever truly lasts.